That happened in 1996, when I was 22 and burning for an adventure. My friends, Mike and Steve, and I decided to explore an abandoned historic village in upstate New York. Legends spoke of a ghost train that haunted the old tracks, but we dismissed them as mere stories until our curiosity got the better of us. The Victorian houses, shrouded in overgrown ivy, seemed frozen in time, only fueling our intrigue. We arrived in the late afternoon, the village eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. The houses, though covered in thick vegetation, retained a haunting old-world charm. We strolled along the rusted tracks, laughing and snapping photos as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the distant rustle of the surrounding forest added to the strange silence. To us, it was just another intriguing place to explore. As twilight gave way to night, a dense fog began to roll in, swallowing the village in a blanket of white. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I chalked it up to the dropping temperature. Mike suggested we head back, but Steve, ever the thrill-seeker, wanted to push further. Reluctantly, we decided to continue, our weak flashlights barely cutting through the growing mist. That's when we heard it, a faint, distant whistle, haunting and slow, echoing through the stillness. We exchanged puzzled glances. Those tracks hadn't seen a train in decades. Trying to shake off the unease, we pressed on. The flashlight beams began to flicker, shadows dancing menacingly in the fog. My heart raced as the mist thickened, making each step forward a challenge. A sudden, blinding light burst behind us, accompanied by the screeching clang of metal on tracks. We spun around, eyes wide, and saw the silhouette of an old train, its form shimmering unnaturally, like a reflection trapped in time. A cold dread settled over us. Panic surged, and we turned to flee, the grotesque apparition looming closer with each passing second. We sprinted through the dense mist, the sound of the train enveloping us from every direction, the whistle piercing the night, the relentless clatter of wheels on rusted rails echoing in our ears. Mike stumbled over a protruding stone, his scream cutting through the chaos. I grabbed his arm, pulling him up as Steve urged us forward, desperation in his eyes. Through the disorienting fog, the outline of an old train station materialized ahead. Without a second thought, we dashed inside, the heavy doors shutting behind us, leaving the surreal nightmare outside as we gasped for breath, hearts pounding in the oppressive silence. Inside the station, a thick layer of dust clung to every surface, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like forgotten shrouds. It offered a fleeting refuge from the suffocating fog outside. We huddled near a broken window, trying to steady our breathing. The air was heavy with the musty scent of mildew and decay, and the distant drip of water echoed through the empty halls. The fog beyond the panes seemed almost sentient, swirling and twisting into grotesque, shifting shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. Then in the shadowed corner of the room, a presence made itself known. A translucent figure stood there, clad in a tattered conductor's uniform that seemed out of place in this forsaken place. His eyes were deep pools of sorrow, staring into our souls as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here. This place does not forgive the curious." The sight of the ghostly conductor left us frozen, fear paralyzing our limbs. My heart pounded so loudly, I felt it resonate in my chest. I struggled to make sense of the apparition before me. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. my voice trembling with fear. The conductor's sad gaze met mine as he repeated, "This place does not forgive the curious. You need to leave before it's too late." Before I could react, he faded away like smoke dissolving into the night air. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the distant haunting whistle of the train, growing louder and more insistent. Panic surged through us. Without a second thought, we sprinted toward the door, but the fog outside had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall of white. Steve suggested we follow the tracks back, but when we glanced down, they had vanished, as if erased from existence. The village around us had transformed. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky, and the once majestic Victorian houses lay in ruins, unrecognizable and menacing. We were ensnared in a distorted mirror of the village. Every familiar landmark warped into something alien and threatening. Desperation clawed at our minds as we wandered aimlessly, hoping to find a path back to reality. Our flashlights dimmed, casting feeble beams that barely pierced the encroaching darkness. Fear gnawed at us, each step heavy with dread. Suddenly, the fog began to lift, the distorted scenery unraveling into its original haunting beauty. The tracks reappeared beneath our feet, solid and familiar once more. The train whistle ceased abruptly, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. We exchanged bewildered glances, the surreal experience leaving us speechless. Without a word, we knew it was time to flee, our shared resolve unspoken but mutual. We stumbled back to the car in oppressive silence, each of us lost in the labyrinth of our own thoughts. The drive home was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. We attempted to discuss what we had witnessed, but no explanation could bridge the gap between our reality and the nightmare we'd endured. To this day, that night in the abandoned village remains an unsolved mystery. Mike and Steve rarely bring it up, and when we meet, the topic is deftly avoided. The experience left an indelible mark on us, a lingering shadow of doubt and fear. The legends of the ghost train continue to haunt my memories, a relentless echo of that fateful night. After my engagement ended, the weight of the breakup pressed heavily on me. I needed space to think, so I opted for a late-night walk through New York City. That night was unnaturally silent, the usual hum of the city replaced by an eerie stillness. I chose to cross the Brooklyn Bridge, a place that had always offered me solace. The city lights shimmered on the East River, casting long, wavering reflections that danced with the ripples. As I walked, my breath visible in the cold air, a figure in white caught my eye in the distance, standing motionless amidst the bridge's arches. At first, I thought she might be a bride taking photos or part of an avant-garde performance. Curious, I approached, the wooden planks creaking softly under my steps. Drawing nearer, unease settled in. The woman wore an antique wedding dress, its lace intricate and time-worn, as if plucked from another century. Her stance was rigid, and her eyes were vacant, staring past me into nothingness. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a stiff, frozen curve that felt unnatural. A shiver traced its way down my back, but I pushed it aside, thinking perhaps she was lost or needed assistance. I called out gently, "Are you okay?" My voice sounded strained, the words thick in the cold night. She didn't respond at first. Then her lips parted, murmuring something about a promise to return. My instincts screamed to leave, but something in her forlorn presence held me back, compelling me to take another step. "Are you okay?" I repeated, louder this time, desperation creeping into my tone. Slowly, she turned her head toward me. Up close, her face was a mask of pallor, almost translucent under the dim light. Her eyes, devoid of life, bore into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "He promised he would come back to me," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally, as if emanating from all directions. A sudden gust of wind whipped around us, the veil of her dress fluttering violently, sending icy droplets across my face. Panic surged. I reached out, trying to offer comfort. "Who hasn't come back? Maybe I can help you find someone." Her response was a high-pitched, jagged laugh that pierced the silence, reverberating off the bridge's metal cables. I watched in horror as her features began to distort, her jaw elongated, teeth sharpening into fangs, and her skin rippling like molten wax. Her eyes sank deeper into their sockets, and her limbs twisted unnaturally, her form becoming grotesque and unrecognizable. Frozen, I stumbled back as she advanced, that terrifying laugh echoing in my ears. Adrenaline overrode fear. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the bridge's planks. The city lights blurred behind me, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Every step echoed loudly in the emptiness, and I was certain I heard footsteps matching my own pace. Glancing over my shoulder, nothing met my eyes. Only the thickening night fog obscured the path ahead. Breathing heavily, my lungs burned from the cold air, but stopping was not an option. The sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every move intensified, each breath a struggle as the bridge seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The oppressive feeling of being hunted drove me onward, desperate to escape the nightmare that felt all too real. When I finally reached the end of the bridge, I pressed myself against a cold iron post, struggling to steady my breath. Every fiber of my being trembled, not just from the biting chill, but from the paralyzing fear that gripped me. It was then that I felt a peculiar weight in my pocket. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached in, pulling out an aged, yellowed piece of paper that hadn't been there moments before. Carefully, I unfolded it, revealing a message scrawled in brittle, old handwriting. He never returned. Don't be the next. A wave of dread washed over me. How had that note found its way into my pocket? I scanned my surroundings desperately, searching for any sign of an explanation. But the street lay deserted, swallowed by the night. The ominous message only deepened my terror, making my skin crawl. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call a friend, but there was no signal. A peculiar occurrence in that well-trafficked area. The oppressive sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every move intensified, forcing me to question my sanity. Was this all a manifestation of my post-engagement despair? I tried to rationalize, but a gnawing intuition whispered that something far more sinister was at play. Left with no clear path, I decided to hail a taxi. As soon as I slid into the back seat, the driver glanced at me through the rear-view mirror with an unsettling look. "You all right, buddy? Looks like you saw a ghost," he remarked with a strained half-smile. My voice trembled as I recounted the night's events, expecting ridicule or disbelief. Instead, his expression hardened, eyes clouding with a serious concern. "You're not the first to see the bridge bride," he said quietly. "They say she haunts those who break promises." My heart plummeted at his words, the weight of his revelation sinking in. Upon arriving home, my legs felt like lead as I hurried to lock every door and window, the clicks echoing ominously in the silent house. Doubt gnawed at me. Was this experience real, or just a figment of my fractured mind? Yet, the palpable fear was undeniable. I sank onto the couch, eyes darting around the dimly lit room, trying to piece together what had transpired. The sense that the woman, or whatever she had been, lingered in the shadows was inescapable. The clock on the wall blinked 3 a.m., and the house seemed to hold its breath, unnaturally still. The taxi driver's mention of broken promises only added to the chaos swirling in my mind, making reality feel increasingly distorted. In the days that followed, the Brooklyn Bridge became a forbidden place in my mind. I avoided passing by it at night, haunted by the memory of that spectral bride. The ominous note remained tucked in my drawer, a constant reminder of that harrowing night. Strangely, whispers of the bridge bride began to surface everywhere. Strangers spoke of her as if her legend had been awakened by my sighting. It felt as though I had been marked, my experience intertwining with countless others in a tapestry of shared fear. Whether it was a supernatural curse or the depths of my own despair, one thing was certain. I never mustered the courage to cross that bridge under the cover of darkness again. The line between reality and nightmare had irrevocably blurred, leaving me to wonder if she was an entity stalking me or merely a manifestation of my shattered psyche. You know how curiosity can claw at you until you can't resist? That's exactly what drove me that night. I'm Jake, a delivery driver in Chicago, leading a straightforward life. The city streets are my domain. I navigate every shortcut and corner like the back of my hand. But one place always lingered in my thoughts: the old abandoned hospital, shrouded in dark stories and whispered urban legends. My mother constantly warned me to stay away, recounting the devastating fire that claimed countless lives, including innocent children. Her voice would drop to a serious, almost desperate tone whenever she spoke of it. But after a grueling day of deliveries, the weight of those warnings felt suffocating. I decided it was time to uncover the truth behind that imposing, decaying structure. With an old flashlight tucked into my pocket and my heart thundering in my chest, I approached the main entrance, where the rusty door seemed to beckon me into a forgotten realm. The moment I pushed the heavy door, a sharp creak shattered the night silence, making my skin crawl. The entrance lobby was swallowed by darkness, save for the narrow beam of my flashlight slicing through the gloom. The air was frigid, thick with the musty scent of mold, intertwined with an acrid, indistinguishable burnt odor that stung my nostrils. The corridors stretched out like a labyrinth lost to time, their endless expanse both disorienting and claustrophobic. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers of old paint, and graffiti marred the walls, telling fragmented stories of those who had wandered these halls before me. I moved cautiously, every detail around me absorbing my full attention. Each step echoed ominously down the empty corridor, amplifying the sensation that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, a faint sound halted me. It was a soft, distant crying, barely audible, yet haunting enough to freeze me in place. It's probably just the wind, I tried to reassure myself. But as I continued, the sound grew louder. Unmistakably, the sorrowful wail of a child. A shiver traced its way down my spine, and my pulse quickened. Despite every rational thought urging me to leave, an inexplicable pull compelled me to follow the sound, a blend of fear and an urgent need to uncover the truth. The crying guided me to a half-open door, from which a flickering, ghostly light seeped into the corridor. I pushed it open with hesitant fingers, revealing a room that still bore the remnants of a children's ward, despite years of abandonment. Small beds stood in neat rows, some draped with aged, moth-eaten sheets, and old toys were scattered across the dusty floor, their colors faded and fabrics torn. In the farthest corner, a hunched silhouette caught my eye. A child, shoulders quivering, as if caught in the throes of silent sobs. "Hey, are you okay?" My voice felt distant, weaker than I intended. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the crying ceased abruptly, plunging the room into a heavy, oppressive silence. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though my heart had ceased to beat. I stood there, frozen, the room's stillness pressing in on me. The air grew colder, each breath a struggle against the chilling atmosphere. I glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but the room remained motionless, the child's silhouette fading into the shadows. A sense of dread settled over me, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurring as I grappled with what I'd just witnessed. My mind raced to rationalize the experience. Was it a lingering echo of the hospital's tragic past, or something far more sinister? The unanswered questions gnawed at me, leaving me with a lingering unease that I couldn't shake as I turned to leave the room. The heavy silence following me out into the endless corridors once more. Curiosity has a way of gnawing at you until resisting becomes impossible. That's exactly what happened to me that night. I'm Jake, a delivery driver in Chicago, living a life as routine as the streets I navigate each day. The city's labyrinthine alleys and bustling corners are second nature to me, but one place always held my attention. The old abandoned hospital, cloaked in dark tales and whispered urban legends. My mother constantly warned me to stay away, her voice heavy with fear as she recounted the devastating fire that ravaged the building, claiming countless lives, including innocent children. Her eyes would dart nervously whenever she spoke of it, pleading with me to heed her warnings. But after a particularly grueling day of deliveries, the weight of her cautions felt suffocating. Determined to uncover the truth behind the imposing, decaying structure, I decided it was time to see for myself. With an old flashlight tucked into my pocket and my heart racing, I approached the main entrance, where the rusty door stood ajar, as if inviting me into its forgotten depths. The moment I pushed the heavy door, a sharp creak sliced through the night silence, making my skin crawl. The entrance lobby was swallowed by darkness, save for the narrow beam of my flashlight piercing the gloom. The air was frigid, thick with the musty scent of mold, intertwined with an acrid, burnt odor that stung my nostrils. The corridors stretched out like a labyrinth lost to time, their endless expanse both disorienting and claustrophobic. Peeling wallpaper revealed layers of old paint, and graffiti marred the walls, telling fragmented stories of those who had wandered these halls before me. I moved cautiously, every detail around me absorbing my full attention. Each step echoed ominously down the empty corridor, amplifying the sensation that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, a faint sound halted me. It was a soft, distant crying, barely audible, yet haunting enough to freeze me in place. It's probably just the wind, I tried to reassure myself, but as I continued, the sound grew louder, unmistakably the sorrowful wail of a child. A shiver traced its way down my spine, and my pulse quickened. Despite every rational thought urging me to leave, an inexplicable pull compelled me to follow the sound, a blend of fear and an urgent need to uncover the truth. The crying guided me to a half-open door, from which a flickering, ghostly light seeped into the corridor. I pushed it open with hesitant fingers, revealing a room that still bore the remnants of a children's ward despite years of abandonment. Small beds stood in neat rows, some draped with aged, moth-eaten sheets, and old toys were scattered across the dusty floor, their colors faded and fabrics torn. In the farthest corner, a hunched silhouette caught my eye. A child, shoulders quivering as if caught in the throes of silent sobs. "Hey, are you okay?" My voice felt distant, weaker than I intended. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the crying ceased abruptly, plunging the room into a heavy, oppressive silence. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though my heart had ceased to beat. Before I could take another step, the child turned their face toward me. Their eyes were two deep voids, and a distorted smile twisted their pale lips into something unnaturally grotesque. A cold wave surged through my entire body, rooting me to the spot. Suddenly, childish laughter echoed through the walls, but it wasn't joyful. Its macabre, distorted tone was like a scratched record playing in reverse. The doors around me began to slam violently, and the lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. A heavy presence loomed closer, the air thickening around me, making each breath a laborious task. I need to get out of here now, I thought, fighting against the rising panic that threatened to paralyze me. I turned abruptly, sprinting down the corridor I had just come from, but the environment seemed to shift unnaturally. The walls constricted, the corridor stretching into an endless maze that defied logic. My footsteps echoed in dissonance with the distorted laughter now emanating from all directions. The beam of my flashlight wavered, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. I felt a cold, bony hand brush against my arm, as if invisible fingers were trying to grasp me. Panic surged, my heart thundering in my ears. "This can't be happening," I murmured, struggling to maintain composure, but the sensation of being relentlessly chased was undeniable. Suddenly, skeletal hands emerged from the walls, clawing hungrily to pull me into the darkness. I fought with every ounce of strength, my fingers clawing at the ethereal appendages, trying desperately to break free. The voices of children whispered my name, their tones laden with malice and despair. A dark mist coalesced before me, morphing into a towering, menacing figure made entirely of shadow. Its eyes burned with intense hatred, and I felt my energy being siphoned away just by being in its presence. Summoning the last reserves of courage within me, I managed to wrench myself free from the spectral grip and bolted in the opposite direction, frantically seeking an exit, when I finally spotted a staircase leading to the lower floor. A spark of hope ignited within me. I hurried down the steps, almost stumbling as the malevolent laughter and whispered threats echoed ominously above. Reaching a corridor that seemed to lead directly to the exit, I saw the emergency door illuminated by the faint moonlight streaming through broken windows. Now or never, I thought, mustering all my remaining strength to sprint toward freedom. However, Before I could reach it, the shadowy figure materialized before me once more, blocking my path. Its eyes glowed with a supernatural intensity, and a guttural voice resonated through the air. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze, the weight of dread anchoring me in place. For a moment, I believed all was lost. But then, I recalled my mother's words, the warnings I had foolishly ignored. With a primal cry of determination, I closed my eyes and ran straight through the entity, feeling an icy sting that seemed to pierce my very soul. I stumbled out the door and collapsed onto the hard ground outside. The fresh night air filled my lungs, and an almost deafening silence enveloped me. The hospital stood there, still and silent, as if nothing had transpired. Struggling to my feet, I didn't hesitate, ran away from there, vowing never to return. In the days that followed, I tried to return to my normal routine, but something inside me had irrevocably changed. Nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, where the distorted laughter and the child's empty eyes haunted my every sleep. My mother noticed my restless nights and growing unease. Concerned, she asked what was wrong. Reluctantly, I confessed my visit to the abandoned hospital. Her eyes darkened with fear, and she handed me an old protective amulet that had been passed down through our family for generations. "This will help you," she whispered, pressing the cold, heavy object into my hand. Determined to move forward, I kept the amulet with me at all times. Gradually, the nightmares began to wane, and the haunting echoes that once tormented me faded into silence. I never approached that place again, honoring the warnings and respecting the stories I had once dismissed as mere legends. Even now, as I navigate the streets of Chicago, I instinctively avoid casting a glance toward the old hospital. A chill often runs down my spine, a lingering reminder of that terrible night. I've promised myself that I will never allow curiosity to lead me into danger again, forever marked by the shadows of the past. My name is Ryan Carter. A few years ago, I worked at New York City Hall, specializing in the maintenance and inspection of urban infrastructure. That fall of 2023, I was assigned to a mission that seemed routine, but would soon unravel into something nightmarish. My colleague, Alex Brooks, a reserved man with eyes that hinted at untold burdens, stood beside me as we prepared to descend into the bowels of the city. The sun was setting, casting elongated shadows that danced across the busy streets above us. The entrance to the tunnels was unassuming, almost swallowed by the aging brick buildings that had withstood countless storms and seasons. We carried flashlights, tools, and faded maps depicting forgotten routes etched onto brittle paper. As we crossed the threshold, the cacophony of the city abruptly ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the light whole. The air grew cold and damp, each breath feeling like inhaling liquid frost, as a creeping unease began to settle in our chests. The modern concrete walls gradually gave way to old bricks, their surfaces slick with moss and etched with inscriptions time had eroded. The narrow beams of our flashlights cast erratic shadows that flickered and twisted along the uneven walls, creating grotesque patterns that seemed to breathe and move with a life of their own. Every step we took echoed ominously in the confined space, amplifying the sensation of being utterly alone. Alex moved ahead, meticulously examining the maps, while I struggled to quell the rising anxiety that gnawed at my resolve. After about half an hour of walking, faint murmurs began to filter through the oppressive silence, indecipherable whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls around us. The shadows shifted subtly, coalescing into forms that vanished when we tried to focus on them, leaving behind a lingering sense of something watching us. A sudden gust of frigid air whooshed past, making our flashlights flicker violently and casting unsettling shadows that danced like specters on the walls. It felt as though the tunnels were reacting to our presence, the atmosphere thickening into something far more sinister with each passing moment. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic reminder of the fear clawing its way up my spine. We pressed forward cautiously, each step weighted with the dread of the unknown. The inscriptions on the walls seemed to whisper forgotten stories, symbols unfamiliar, yet resonating with an ancient, eerie significance. Alex, ever the observant one, suddenly halted and pointed to a side opening barely visible in the dim light. Our flashlight beams converged on a small hall beyond, revealing an improvised altar at the center. The room was dominated by a makeshift altar draped in tattered cloth, surrounded by worn candles that flickered erratically, casting wavering shadows. Ancient objects lay scattered chaotically, glass bottles filled with murky, strangely colored liquids, partially melted candles that dripped wax like blood, and small amulets dangling from rusted wires, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hall, the temperature dropping noticeably. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out towards us, whispering secrets in the darkness. My mind raced, trying to piece together the purpose of this unholy display. Was it a remnant of forgotten rituals, or something more malevolent? The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and something acrid, like decaying flesh, that made my stomach churn. "Alex, what is all this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I don't know," he finally replied, his voice tense. "But it doesn't feel right. We should document this and get out." Before we could react, the temperature plummeted further, and the room seemed to close in around us. The candle's flames flared wildly, casting the altar into sharp, chaotic relief. The air vibrated with a low, humming energy, and the shadows began to twist into more defined, grotesque shapes, figures that loomed at the edge of our vision, just out of reach. A piercing scream shattered the oppressive silence, echoing through the tunnels like a death knell. Panic surged through me as the realization hit. Something was terribly wrong. "We need to leave now," I shouted, grabbing Alex's arm. But as we turned to retrace our steps, the corridor behind us had transformed. The walls seemed to pulse and breathe, narrowing and stretching impossibly, creating a labyrinth that defied all logic. Our flashlights flickered and dimmed, their beams darting erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. Footsteps echoed around us, each step a heavy thud that reverberated through the tunnels. The whispers grew louder, now clearly chanting in a language long forgotten, filling the air with malevolent intent. Shadows slithered along the walls, reaching out with elongated limbs that grasped at our clothes and skin. The oppressive darkness pressed in, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. My mind screamed to stay calm, but the sheer terror of our predicament left me paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, skeletal hands emerged from the walls, fingers like brittle branches clawing hungrily at our flesh. I stumbled back, desperately trying to shield myself, as the hands pulled and tore at my clothing, leaving icy trails down my arms. Alex was similarly ensnared, his face contorted in pain and fear. The chanting intensified, now accompanied by guttural growls that seemed to emanate from the very walls. A dark mist began to coalesce in front of us, swirling into the form of a towering figure shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed with a supernatural fire, and an overwhelming sense of hatred emanated from its presence, draining the warmth from my body. Summoning every ounce of courage, I broke free from the spectral grip and pulled Alex towards the exit. We ran through the shifting corridors, the oppressive darkness seemingly determined to swallow us whole. The chanting and growls followed, relentless and unyielding, as if the tunnels themselves were alive and intent on keeping us trapped. The flashlight beams danced frantically, casting erratic shadows that seemed to mock our futile attempts to escape. Just as exhaustion threatened to overtake me, we burst into a final corridor that led directly to the exit. The emergency door stood before us, its metal frame glinting faintly in the dim light. Now or never, I thought, my legs moving on autopilot as I sprinted towards freedom. But before we could reach it, the shadowy figure materialized between us and the door, blocking our path. Its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul, and a guttural voice resonated through the air. "You shouldn't be here." Frozen in place, I felt the weight of despair pressing down on me, the walls closing in as the entity loomed larger. But then, a flicker of memory surfaced. My mother's warnings about respecting the city's forgotten places, about the darkness that lingered in the unseen corners. With a primal scream, I forced myself to move, pushing past the figure with a burst of adrenaline that sent me tumbling through the door and onto the hard ground outside. Gasping for breath, I turned to look back at the entrance, only to see the tunnel sealed shut as if nothing had happened. Alex and I stumbled away from the site, our minds reeling from the encounter. In the days that followed, we avoided the tunnels, the memory of that night etched into our minds like a scar. Ryan never forgot the sight of the towering shadow, the chanting that echoed in his ears, or the skeletal hands that reached for him. The experience left him questioning the very fabric of reality, haunted by the knowledge that beneath the city's bustling surface lay secrets best left undisturbed. The air in that space was suffocating, thick with the acrid scent of burnt wax mingling with the dank, musty odor of mold and decay. Alex approached the altar with hesitant steps, every movement betraying his growing unease. I watched him closely, my own apprehension mounting as I took in every unsettling detail. Suddenly, a female figure materialized from the shadows, her presence both ethereal and menacing. Her eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, reflecting the flashlight beams in a way that felt otherworldly. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, as she fixed her gaze on us, her expression a haunting blend of sorrow and latent threat. In that instant, Alex vanished before my eyes, swallowed whole by the oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse around us. Panic clawed at my chest as I grappled with Alex's disappearance. My heart raced uncontrollably, and my hands slicked with cold sweat. Yet I knew I had to act swiftly. The female figure remained, her piercing eyes unblinking, as if she could see straight into my soul. Shadows around us began to writhe and contort, twisting into indistinct shapes that stretched along the walls like living nightmares. I realized the only escape was to flee, even though I had no idea where I was running. I bolted down the narrow corridor, tripping over uneven stones that seemed to emerge from the darkness. The oppressive atmosphere pressed in on me, each breath a struggle as distant whispers morphed into sinister murmurs. The walls twisted and shifted, narrowing with each frantic step, while the malevolent whispers grew louder, filled with a palpable malice. Shadows multiplied, forming grotesque figures that darted just beyond my peripheral vision, relentless in their pursuit. Disorientation clouded my mind, each turn making the labyrinthine tunnels feel more like a living entity intent on trapping me. Finally, a flicker of light appeared in the distance, a promise of freedom. Summoning every ounce of remaining strength, I sprinted toward it, ignoring the tendrils of darkness that reached out to ensnare me. The walls continued to morph, but I dodged the tightening sections, the warmth of the surface inching closer with each desperate step. My heart pounded erratically, each thud echoing like a drum in my ears. As I reached the opening, I thrust myself against the heavy iron door, the fresh night air rushing into my lungs as I collapsed onto the hard ground outside. Exhausted and trembling, I looked back, but the tunnel entrance stood as it had before, silent and unremarkable, as if nothing had transpired. I stumbled to my feet, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving my nerves jittery and raw. Without a second thought, I ran back to the city, refusing to glance behind me for fear that the shadows were still lurking in the darkness. Since that night, I never ventured into the tunnels again, confiding my experience only to a handful of trusted colleagues. Yet, even now, remnants of that terrifying encounter haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I catch faint whispers on the wind or feel an unseen presence watching my every move, a constant reminder that something dark still resides in the underground corridors of Manhattan. I'll never forget that day. My friends and I had always been drawn to abandoned places steeped in dark histories, so when we heard about the Harper Building in downtown Chicago, it seemed like the perfect choice for our next adventure. The building's reputation was chilling. Back in the 1970s, a fierce fire consumed the internal stairs, trapping several people who never escaped. Determined to uncover its mysteries, we arrived early in the afternoon, equipped with flashlights, cameras, and a restless curiosity. From the moment we stepped inside, a heavy, oppressive presence settled over us. The walls were etched with decades-old graffiti, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of mold mingled with the lingering sting of smoke. As we navigated the labyrinthine hallways, an unsettling stillness enveloped the space, broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to echo from every corner. My friends exchanged nervous chuckles, attempting to dispel the tension, but the sensation of unseen eyes watching our every move was unmistakable. Shadows twisted and contorted on the walls, their shapes morphing unpredictably, heightening our unease with each cautious step deeper into the building. We pressed on through the narrow corridors, our footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast silence. Without warning, A sudden, sharp chill swept past me, sending a shiver down my spine and prickling my skin. I glanced at my friends, noticing their discomfort mirrored in their tense expressions, yet none dared to speak. Determined to continue, we moved forward, but the sense of being observed only intensified. Our flashlights began to falter, their beams wavering erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that seemed to writhe independently of any light source. Turning a corner into a side corridor, we discovered a staircase descending into the bowels of the building. The door was slightly open, and a dim, unnatural light seeped through, revealing a rusty metal staircase that spiraled into darkness. Hesitation flickered among us, but curiosity ultimately overcame our fear. Reluctantly, we began our descent, each step protesting under our weight with a mournful creak. In the basement, the air grew even heavier, thick, with an oppressive density that made each breath laborious. The earlier murmurs grew clearer, now forming fragmented words that hinted at desperate pleas for help. That's when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A fleeting shadow darted across the far wall, too swift and deliberate to be dismissed. My heart raced, and doubt gnawed at me, questioning whether we should turn back. The whispers swelled into a cacophony of indistinct voices, their urgency palpable. Lucas attempted to revive the main flashlight, but it sputtered and died, plunging us into near-total darkness, save for the sporadic flicker of our backup lights. It was then we realized the shadows around us were no longer mere darkness. They twisted into human-like forms, gliding silently through the basement with malevolent intent. Panic surged through me as the reality of our situation set in. We decided we had to leave, but the staircase seemed to stretch on infinitely, each step echoing like a scream in the suffocating silence, trapping us in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As we desperately searched for a way back, the shadows seemed to cling to us, always lingering just beyond the corner of my eye. In a moment of panic, I stumbled over something on the ground, a burnt piece of paper, its edges singed by the flames that had ravaged the building decades ago. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, straining to decipher the fragmented words. "Help us. Trapped here forever." The message sent a chill through my entire body, freezing us in place. That's when one of the shadows advanced, revealing an indistinct figure with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to silently plead for rescue. Without a second thought, we bolted up the stairs, the sound of whispers and distorted laughter echoing ominously behind us, until we finally burst through the basement entrance door. We gasped for fresh air, our lungs burning with relief, but an uneasy feeling lingered, a persistent chill that hinted something unseen had followed us out. The weight of what we had witnessed pressed heavily on each of us. As we tried to leave the basement, daylight felt almost mocking compared to the darkness we carried within. Silence enveloped us, each of us lost in our own thoughts, grappling with the reality of our experience. Determined to end our exploration, we turned to leave, only to realize the path behind us had transformed. The familiar corridors now twisted unnaturally, as if the building itself was contorting to prevent our escape. Doors that were once ajar were now firmly locked, and hallways stretched endlessly, looping back on themselves in impossible configurations. Panic set in as anxiety took hold of everyone. We sprinted through corridors that seemed to elongate with each step, the shadows relentlessly pursuing us, their whispers growing more frantic and incomprehensible. Lucas tripped over an unseen obstacle, and as I turned to help him, the same figure with empty eyes materialized directly in front of us, its presence suffocating. Heart-pounding, we pushed ourselves to move faster, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, through a haze of desperation, we spotted a broken window leading to the outside. With a combined effort, we forced it open and tumbled onto the street, gasping in the cool night air, leaving the Harper building's malevolent grip behind. Even after escaping, the sensation of being watched clung to us, a lingering presence that refused to dissipate. To this day, whenever I pass by that forsaken building, an involuntary shiver runs down my spine, a haunting reminder of the terror we endured and the shadows that still linger in my mind.